the cases that I want to talk about this week are not cases that any judgment has been released or anything like that. There have been no opinions, but they were oral arguments this week. And these two court cases that I'm going to mention are kind of related in some capacity. They relate to the same kind of issue regarding the relationship between government and free speech and how it interacts with private entities, okay? So I'll talk about each of these individually and then kind of talk about the broader principles at play. So the first is Murthy versus Missouri, okay? So this really deals with the question of did the Biden administration violate the First Amendment when it pressured social media companies to engage in censorship? Okay, so some of the examples in the case that were brought up. The first is the White House telling Twitter to, quote, get moving in taking down an anti-vax tweet by Robert Kennedy Jr. Okay, they said that they told Twitter that they need to get moving. Okay, so you can see that they're exerting some pressure on Twitter to hurry things up in that regard. The other example was asking Facebook, quote, are you guys effing serious? And then badgering Facebook over the course of a few days and weeks about censoring misinformation in July 2021. Okay, so these were two of the examples cited, and again, this question of does the Biden administration and the Biden administration officials telling Twitter and Facebook or even pressuring them to get moving or to do these to do what the government wants them to do, is that violating the First Amendment? Violating because it was pressuring those companies to censor Americans and American speech. Okay, and so that's the first case, and kind of caveat here, I'm no legal expert, and so take all of this kind of with a grain of salt. But when we see here is not in my opinion any sort of violation of the First Amendment, and here's why. First, the government in general, Biden administration, any administration, they are allowed to advocate and push even private entities, even private companies, to do certain things that they want them to do. For example, okay, if there were a company that were polluting, and the government is allowed to tell that and even pressure that company to stop polluting, and is that a violation of First Amendment by doing that, by forcing them to do that, or anything like that? No, it's not. Okay, the government is always pressuring companies and people and individuals to do things. Okay. But the question becomes, how are they pressuring them? How did the Biden administration pressure these social media companies to censor Americans? Did they threaten them? Not really, right? You can read these as pressuring, but you can't really necessarily read these comments that the Biden officials made as anything beyond simply advocating and pushing them to do something. They didn't necessarily threaten to do anything, right? So that's an important distinction, because the government, in a sense, is allowed to say whatever, right? Is allowed to pressure in whatever way, as long as it's just simply pressuring via speech. Okay, it can't necessarily, though, say do this or else, right? Then that kind of enforcement mechanism, threatening, that's a different story. Okay. And so, but here we don't necessarily have that with these companies, with these social media companies. And so, and a lot of the things that I've read and listened to, most people suspect that this case is going to be a pretty big margin victory for the Biden administration as not violating the First Amendment, and I think that will be the right call, because again, the government can say and advocate. I mean, that's part of what politicians do for a living, is advocate for different positions and advocate for different things. In this case, they wanted this private company to do something, right? To do a particular action. That doesn't mean that they forced the social media companies to do that. It simply means they were trying to be persuasive and even pressuring. But as long as they're not threatening, there's a distinction. And that's important to keep in mind when we talk about this next case. So that's the NRA versus Vulo, another oral hearing that took place. And this, this one kind of does verge into that territory of the government was actually enforcing, threatening, and using its power to disincentivize companies from associating with different points of view. Okay, so there is a distinction. I think that the Supreme Court is going to define and identify a distinction between these two cases, and I hope that you see the distinction as well. So at the central kind of tenet of this case, so this is from SCOTUS blog, is, quote, whether the First Amendment allows a government regulator to threaten regulated entities with adverse regulatory actions if they do business with a controversial speaker, as a consequence of the government's own hostility to the speaker's viewpoint or a perceived general backlash against the speaker's advocacy. Okay, so what does that exactly mean? So here's what happened in this case. You have Vullo, who was the leader of the New York State Department of Financial Services. Okay, so that's the DFS. The DFS, Department of Financial Services, regulates all the big banks and insurance companies in New York City. Now, imagine what that means. That's an insanely powerful position because all of the big banks and all of the big insurance companies that are located in New York City, okay, they're all basically headquartered there in some capacity. And so that means that she has he or she, I don't know if it's a male or female, has a ton of authority over these major banks and insurance companies. Okay, so what happened? Well, this regulator of these banks and insurance companies issued guidance and statements encouraging these banks and insurers to assess and potentially end their affiliations with gun promotion organizations like the NRA. Okay, so now what you have is you have a regulatory body approaching banks like JP Morgan, like Citigroup, etc., okay, and insurance companies saying don't do business with the NRA because of their gun advocacy positions. And as a result of that, you had these big banks and insurance companies stop doing business with the NRA. So, because why wouldn't they, right? They're being threatened by their regulatory agency that has significant power over them and is now threatening with that power, okay, to disassociate not because of any illegal activity that the NRA was doing, nothing like that, but simply because of their viewpoint in gun advocacy. Okay, so their viewpoint that should be protected is now being trounced upon by the regulators. And you can say, well, it wasn't the regulators. The regulators didn't do anything with the NRA. They simply told banks and insurance companies not to associate with them. So that's the question in this case. Can a regulatory body, can the government go through basically a third party to punish a group, an organization, for their political viewpoints? And I have a suspicion that the Supreme Court is going to rule that that is indeed a violation of the First Amendment. Okay, so again, taking these two cases in tandem, let's think about the differences here. The first one, you have government officials, you have administrative officials pushing, pressing, pressuring the companies, private companies, to do a particular thing, to censor a particular view, okay? But they're just advocating for that. They're not actually issuing guidance. They're not threatening regulation. They're not threatening legislation. They're doing none of that. They're simply saying you should censor these things, okay? That's different. That is a different thing. That is government officials doing what government officials do, advocating for things. That's a different category than the second case where you have a regulatory body that is actively using its power, its authority over these entities to discriminate based on viewpoint. Okay, so there's some similarities between these two cases in the relationship between government and free speech in the First Amendment, but there are some differences here. The major one being the level that government power was threatened. Okay, and that does matter. Again, politicians do and can say a lot of things and advocate and pressure and push companies to do and say and a lot of things. That's kind of their job, but they can't threaten and use their power to make it happen, which is kind of what you see in that second case.